Hey guys, we are back up in the Power Rankings for Survivor 48 following episode 12, the penultimate episode of the season, and this was definitely a fine episode, definitely better than the previous two, even though the actual result was not the greatest by the end of it, but we'll get to it soon enough. But we have 6 people to talk about, and there's more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 6, we have the latest boot from this season, and here we have Shaheen. And to me, I felt like this was pretty apparent, where I feel like there was a lot of setup to the Shaheen boot across a lot of the episode. We're early on, we have him like getting this big moment before winning the reward challenge, which felt like a culmination of what we got from him in the previous episode where he had complained so much about not winning a challenge, but here he is finally winning one. But then he immediately gets dunked on when the likes of Camila complain about the fact that he took Joe on the reward and claiming that he was fueling the biggest threat in the game, which eventually leads to Joe winning immunity. And there was just a lot of setup to Camila being frustrated by Shaheen here. And then obviously there's this massive plan by the likes of Kyle and Camila where they talk about this game of chicken and how Shaheen was the first to talk about targeting Joe and Eva, which in turn leads to Kyle wanting to target Shaheen, seemingly as his play to make it seem like that Kyle and Camila are the real masterminds of the season, how they're manipulating Joe into cutting one of his own numbers there. And considering how much the show is propping up Kyle and Camila for wanting to make this plan go through, it just made it pretty clear that the plan was going to succeed and that Shaheen was going to be on his way out. And especially with Joe not having much evidence in the episode to believing that Kyle and Camila were the ones doing the wrongdoing, where it seems like he was more so upset at Shaheen. It did make a lot of sense that Shaheen would go out by the end of it. And I've already talked about Shaheen in previous Power Rankings, how I was pretty much out on him. And it was sort of funny seeing a lot of people defending him, even as late as last week. However, I feel like there was just so many red flags for Shaheen across a lot of the season, with him coming off as this big player. And I feel like across the post-merge, there was just so much setup to him like having this downfall down the road, with him being overconfident. Now I will say that his downfall coming in this episode is a bit interesting, considering it did seem like he was actually wanting to go to the end with Joe and Eva, which makes the fact that he gets voted out by them even more funny. But I do feel like Shaheen is someone who I was out on by the time he gets taken out here. And obviously with the setup to him going to the episode, it's not too shocking by the end of it, even though he wasn't my pick to go out initially coming into the episode. But obviously Shaheen is now out of the game to where he's here at number 6. And with that, we have 5 people left in the game to talk about. And as usual, upper ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But at number 5, the person I believe is the least likely to win coming into the finale is Mitch. And this isn't too shocking here, where Mitch doesn't really get that much to do across the actual episode, where despite him getting his usual fare of talking about how now is the time to make a big move, his idea of a big move is targeting Shaheen, which is pretty misguided there. And even beyond that, he doesn't get that much to do across the episode, where he only gets like 2 confessionals in the episode, one in which he talks about how he's glad to make it to the final 6 and how he wants to make the move now. And the other confessional is him complaining about Shaheen setting Joe on the reward, which seems to be the rationale that Mitch uses to target it, Shaheen in this spot. But at the end of the day, I feel like considering how much he had talked about wanting to make this big move, I feel like targeting Shaheen in this spot is a bit underwhelming in that regard. But either way, I feel like, especially now that Shaheen's out of the game, Mitch is very likely to be a losing finalist, where I very much see it as Mitch being dragged to the end by Joe and Eva in a spot to where he just loses at the end. Now there's a possibility that he'd also be thrown into fire where he beats Kyle in that spot, but I feel like regardless, it is all clear setup to Mitch like going out and losing at the end, where again, I feel like he is someone who has been getting a lot of setup to him like failing in the game and him complaining about the fact that he lacks any agency. And considering that the likes of Joe, Eva, even Kyle are seen as bigger jury threats, both from a game perspective, but also from an edit perspective, I just don't see how Mitch wins the game for this point. So it's because of that, he's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have another person who I think is not winning at this point, and here we have Eva. And again, this episode was not the greatest for Eva either, where while they do get their way in targeting Shaheen, it's also in a spot to where they're just taking out one of their own allies there. And even on that, Eva gets her usual content about how she's a team player, how she cares more about securing the safety of her team, and how that's more important than her own individual safety, which explains why she didn't use her safety without power. Even on that, she talks about how she trusts Kyle a lot, even though Kyle seems to be undercutting Joe and Eva in the spot by seemingly target Shaheen in the spot, and they do eventually go along with that plan. And even on that, she gets another confessional back at camp, talking about how she wasn't picked for reward, and talking about how it feels like she's at home being babysat by her parents, which doesn't seem like a great sign there. I just feel like Eva is someone who didn't really pop off in this episode. And at this point, I feel like my view of her is unchanged. I feel like she's someone who probably gets to the end of the game, especially now with how the game's be breaking down. However, I do think she's going to lose at the end. where I do feel like she has a clean path to the end in the sense that she has an idol to use for Final 5 and Final 4. She probably gets taken to the end. I don't really see any reason to target her unless the likes of Joe is taken out Final 5. But really, I don't see how Eva wins the game, even if she gets to the end. So not feeling great about her either, which is why she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is largely unchanged compared to last week. But number 3, we do have Camila. And to me, I think Camila is probably the person that goes in 5th here. I feel like it's very likely that Joe's going to find out in the next round that Kyle and Camila were the ones that were plotting this whole lie of trying to throw Shaheen under the bus. And through that, I think Joe and Eva take a strike at Camila probably. And I think Camila goes out in 5th here, where even though she does get a lot propping up in this episode for this plan of targeting Shaheen, it's also in a spot to where, one, it's kind of silly for their gains in the sense that their whole idea is that they're trying to undercut Joe by making it seem like they're the ones that are really driving the game as opposed to actually targeting them. And yes, while they couldn't get out Joe anyway due to Joe winning immunity, it's also kind of a play that I don't think is going to work at the end, where even though I can see the argument that the likes of a Joe may not be respected by the jury, considering that he is preaching on honor and integrity, and they could see themselves as being like a Marianne taking on Mike at Final Tribal and sort of blowing the jury's minds in that regard. I just don't think it's going to work, especially with the way the ad's been breaking down. And I think if we're comparing Kyle and Camila, I think Camila is the most likely to be targeted before the end, where I feel like Kyle is way more so the main character of the season, whereas I feel like Camila is someone who is pretty primed to be like the first boot out in the finale. And especially in a spot to where if the likes of Kyle were to win immunity, then I could see Camila being taken out instead, or maybe they split the vote in that spot. So I do feel like either way, Camila's probably cooked. I feel like she was already dead for a long time from an edit standpoint, where I feel like Kyle's been overshadowing her, but I just feel like there's just so much potential for Kyle and Camila to be caught, where there's been a lot of focus about how they've been in the secret duo for a lot of the game, and there was even this talk about this being Icarus time. So I do feel like at this point, it's probably time for Camila to go. So because of that, she's here on number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and what do you know, this is once again unchanged from last week. By number 2, we do have Kyle. And like I said with Camila, I do feel like this plan is a bit misguided, where while I do think there is some upside on paper in the sense that they're probably banking on the fact that Joe will not own up to his game, and through that they can try to paint Joe as his figurehead, I just don't think it's going to work, especially with the way the edit's been presenting Joe, where it seems like despite them feeling like that Joe's not this big jury threat, that in reality, the show's been still treating Joe very seriously, where even though Joe does stuff like get paranoid, and we even see that in this episode, I still feel like they take the time to present Joe as his very rootable figure. And through that, I just don't see how the likes of Joe loses a jury vote, especially when this seems to be Kyle's plan, trying to undercut Joe. I just don't think it's going to pan out in the way that he thinks it will. And on top of that, I feel like with the amount of emphasis there's been on the fact that Kyle and Camila have been the secret duo for so much of the game and how that's then been their biggest asset, I feel like it makes a lot of sense that Joe will pick up on Kyle. And especially with how the tribal was shot, where we saw Joe really zoning in on both Shaheen and Kyle, implying that Joe may be finally starting to pick up on Kyle's game a bit. And through that, I think Joe probably targeted Kyle in a spot to where Joe will probably win that battle and get Kyle out of the game. So at this point, I don't think Kyle is winning per se. I do feel like this episode just further confirmed to me that Joe is going to win the battle. However, in some universe where Joe is cut before the end, where Kyle and Camila are this duo that's able to triumph over Joe and Eva, I do think Kyle's still the most likely winner. I think Kyle's someone who probably is more likely to get the final trial based on the edit, and is probably the person who can definitely win against the likes of an Eva and Mitch at this point. So either way, I feel like Kyle's probably the second most likely person to win. Even though I don't think he's going to win, I think he's probably going to be cut. I think the episode highly implied that Joe is about to catch on to Kyle and in turn target him. So because of that, I feel like Kyle's probably set up to lose, which is why he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 48 coming into the finale is Joe. And I feel like this episode just further confirmed to me that Joe is clearly being set up to win. He's clearly being set up to be the rooting interest of the season, and someone who, despite clearly having flaws as a player, I think is going to win the battle by the end of it. Now, yes, I think from a pure game standpoint, I still think we are seeing some of Joe's paranoia, where despite him having immunity in this round, he still gets upset when he comes to believe that Shaheen could be flipping on him. And the fact that he even believes it in the first place is obviously pretty questionable. And the fact that Joe then proceeds to vote out Shaheen is obviously not great for his game. It does show that he is being outplayed by Kyle and Camila in this spot, where it seemed like Shaheen was willing to take Joe to the end. Now, yes, there is a question over whether Shaheen would actually beat Joe or not, though we'll have to see how Exit Press works and whether people would have voted for Shaheen or not. I currently question it, but there could be some new information that comes out later on. But regardless, I do think from a pure positioning standpoint, I do think Joe voting at Shaheen is definitely questionable and would be a nod to his winning game if we were to win. However, I don't think the show is presenting Joe as being a bad player, where even though Joe does get upset and acts all pouty, and we even see Shaheen point this out, I do think Joe is still shown being somewhat calm here and someone who is like sort of like weighing all the options, where we see him like talk about how he needs to take a moment to like reassess things and piece things together. We see him a tribal, like having that ridiculous moment of him just zoning in on Kyle and zoning in on Shaheen as they're talking, which I find interesting there. And again, I feel like the show is definitely going out of its way to explain why Joe is making the decision he does and really showing him to be someone who, despite him having these tendencies to be paranoid, is at least taking the time to consider all the options and is shown like in a competent way there. So I do feel like that is something that really plays into Joe's favor. But beyond that, Joe also gets a lot of personal content in this episode, particularly talking about his sister, which I'm actually surprised that it took us this long in the season for us to learn about Joe's sister when he talked so much about his sister in his preseason interviews, but we're only learning about it now on the show. But it is still a powerful moment and definitely something that really propels Joe, makes him come off as a very rootable figure there. He obviously wins immunity, his 4th immunity of the season, and is actually in a position to break the US record if he ends up winning the last 2 immunity challenges, which is pretty good there. So I do feel like at this point, I think this episode just further confirmed to me that Joe is still the most likely person to win. Now, is it a guarantee? I don't think so. I think at this point, I would say it's probably a 95% chance that Joe wins. Though I think the 5% is definitely on this chance that the likes of Kyle and Camila like are being propped up as a secret duo, and the fact that they have been able to maintain this secret connection throughout the game could be Joe's undoing there. Not to mention that people like Shaheen have talked previously about how Joe may not be the biggest jury threat, though even Shaheen does admit by the end of it that he got outplayed by Joe. So I do feel like Joe is winning. I feel like I'm making my claim here. I think Joe is going to win Survivor 48. I made that pretty clear during a lot of the post-merge, and I think this episode just further solidified that view. And while there is a slight chance that I could end up being wrong here, I think considering all the evidence that I have, I think coming into this finale, I think Joe's the most likely to win. And for that reason, I have him here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps with the channel. Now, I will also be making my jury scenarios video. And after the season, I'll be doing some postseason coverage, such as my player ranking and my reviews. So be on the lookout for that. And obviously, as we head into this off season, I'll be doing other general stuff as we get into Big Brother, which I can't believe we're getting close to Big Brother season already. I'm on Patreon and if you do membership. So if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.